Welcome, everyone. I'm Brian Amcrott, the Executive Director of the Laura and Alvin Siegel Lifelong Learning Program at Case Western Reserve University. We're pleased to welcome you to tonight's program with Professor Robert Watson. Before I introduce Robert, I do just want to note, some of you already know, the recent passing of Laura Siegel, our benefactor and namesake for our program. Laura and Alvin, for whom our program is named, were devoted lifelong learners for many, many years. And among their many gifts to our program, we're introducing myself and subsequently Cheryl and everyone else in our program to Robert Watson, who at the time was teaching in the lifelong learning program at Florida Atlantic University. And Laura and Alvin, as part of their real dedication to the ongoing education, when they wintered in Florida, did not stop their learning. So they learned with us here in Cleveland and with Robert and some of his colleagues during their winters in Florida. So we recognize their commitment really throughout much of their lifetime and their ongoing legacy through our program. It is my pleasure this evening to welcome back virtually to Cleveland Professor Robert Watson, who is an award-winning author who's published over 40 books and roughly 200 scholarly articles and chapters on topics in history and politics, as well as 2 multi-edition encyclopedia sets on the presidents and first ladies. He is currently writing a book about an early pandemic that caused the evacuation of the capital city. And you might have heard him mention a little bit about that work. So a little bit of a preview for something we can get you to talk about in the future. Even though you might think that my introduction to Robert is a bit lengthy, I've actually pared down his bio quite significantly. In addition to his scholarly work, he is a frequent media commentator, having been interviewed thousands of times by news outlets around the world, including CNN, MSNBC, USA Today, the New York Times, NPR, BBC, and others. He has convened national conferences on the American presidency, co-founded the annual Truman Legacy Symposium for the Truman Presidential Library, and served on the boards of numerous academic associations, community organizations, and the Harry Truman Foundation, Calvin Coolidge Foundation, and George McGovern Center for Leadership. As a community leader, Professor Watson has hosted many voter registration drives, very important this time of year for us to think about that, mock elections and civic education programs for schools, workshops for social studies teachers, and has served as a judge for History Day contests, pronouncer for spelling bees, and moderator for political debates and community town halls. He is the recipient of many awards for his contributions to the study of the presidency, election commentary, community service, civics programs, and efforts to combat anti-Semitism and incivility. He has won teaching and service awards at Florida Atlantic University and Lynn University. Robert was born in Harrisburg, attended public schools in nearby Hershey, and was educated at Virginia Tech, where he was a member of the football and track teams. But his true hope for the future is the production of a Robert Watson biopic, where they can engage the actor Corey Stoll to play the part of Brian Amcrott at the Siegel Lifelong Learning Program. So at least we get a nice laugh out of you. I turn the virtual podium over to Professor Robert Watson.
Brian, thank you. Hello, everyone. Brian, I was hoping that you would put that somewhere in the introduction. Everybody, Brian and I were communicating before this, and that's what I told him to say in the introduction. He's got his twin is one of my favorite actors, but it's wonderful to see Brian and Cheryl. They become dear friends over the years, and I had contacted Cheryl a little while ago saying, I wish I could come to Cleveland. The hospitality there is always wonderful. I always have a great visit, and much of it because of the getting a chance to hang out with Brian and Cheryl. So thank you, and it's good to see you. Also want to say hello to my buddy Claire, who's on the call today. And speaking of voter registration, Brian, Claire is active with the League of Women Voters, and we have some of her colleagues coming in next week. We're going to try a virtual voter registration, which ought to be interesting. I've done one every semester of my 3-decade-long career, so now we're going to try something virtually. Before I get into this, just a quick word on Laura Siegel. What a wonderful woman. I was saying to Cheryl earlier that it's entirely fitting that part of Laura and Alvin's wonderful legacy involves lifelong learning, because they were two of the most inquisitive people I've ever had the privilege of knowing. And I remember them from years ago when they would come down to South Florida in the winters, and they would, before and after my speeches, a big smile, several questions. They just had an unquenchable thirst for learning, which obviously they continued by creating this wonderful program that all of you benefit from. I put together a PowerPoint, everybody, so I'm going to try it here. Oops, my PowerPoint disappeared, Cheryl. Let's try this again. I don't see where it's, oh.
I definitely don't have access to your screen, so you've got to find it.
Interesting. It worked earlier, and then
Yes.
I just lost it. Okay. Well, let me try one thing here off camera and see if that will, if you'll bear with me. I'm going to try to drag it into the into this and see if that works. I just pulled it up. Let me know if you can see this. I just dragged it in. Does it come in?
No.
It doesn't? Okay, shucks. Oh, well, a lot of good.
Did you hit?
Did you actually share your screen, Robert? You have to click.
Yeah, I
the-
did earlier. Yeah, and it worked.
You might have to do it again.
No, but you have to hit share screen again.
I did. Yeah, let's try it one more time. And I was
There
just.
you go.
Did it come up?
Yeah,
Yep.
Okay. Now I can't see it.
just put it on full screen.
Okay. Yeah, I have no, interestingly, it's not on my screen. So how weird. So let me take a look at this one more time. Yeah, I lost it on my end. Huh, how odd. Okay. I was just.
Robert,
yeah.
Robert, real quick, do you have something that says view options towards the top of your screen?
I lost almost all my Zoom just as I clicked it. How weird, huh?
Oh,
So yeah, you can see what the first page. You can see-
yes,
it should say 100 years.
correct.
Okay. Well,
But it's not on the full screen, which is what's
interesting.
weird.
What does it say right now? Does it still say 100 years?
No, it says the story of the 19th Amendment.
Okay, I'm just going to click where I know that you're supposed to click into the ether and see if it advances. Okay. Well, I jinxed us by saying in 100 Zoom talks this summer, it's never gone wrong. So, so I have the pleasure of talking about the 19th Amendment and 100 years of women in politics. This is the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which is a wonderful story full of all sorts of twists and turns. I'm happy to take questions on this or anything at the end. So let me jump right into it. And did that advance, Cheryl? We got the story of the 19th Amendment? Even if
Yes,
it's not a large screen? Okay, good. So you're looking at two of the founding mothers where our story begins. On the left would be Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and on the right is Lucretia Mott. So our story begins in the year 1840. In 1840, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was from New York, was remarkably well-read. She was a political activist and involved in social justice through her work on behalf of ending slavery. She was a hardcore abolitionist. Lucretia Mott was a Quaker from Massachusetts. And of course, the Quakers had a proud tradition of education, pacifism, fighting for rights of the American Indian, and to end slavery. And she was on the forefront of all of that. So in 1840, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had gotten married. And you gotta love this. She says to her husband what she wants to do for her honeymoon. There's an international anti-slavery convention in Europe. That's what she wants to do for her honeymoon. My kind of gal. So they get on a wooden ship, they cross the Atlantic Ocean and go all the way to Europe for the anti-slavery convention. They get there and guess what? Women were not allowed in. I mean, that's wrong on so many levels. Meanwhile, Lucretia Mott goes all the way across the ocean to Europe, and she's not allowed in. So the two of them are outside of the convention stewing, and that's where they meet one another. And they're talking about, when we get back to America, we need to have a women's rights convention, the same way we're talking about anti-slavery. So they vowed to work together. While they're talking, there was a break during the convention, and one of the men who had attended comes out and meets them and strikes up a conversation. He also is shocked and appalled that women are not allowed in. He would become great friends with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and join them in trying to promote women's rights. That man's name, Frederick Douglass, the great former slave orator. So Douglass teams up with Stanton and Mott when they get back to the United States, and they start working on a convention. That would come to fruition in 1848 in New York with the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. There were over 300 conferees that gathered in early July, the same way the Constitutional Convention and the convention that put together the Declaration of Independence in '76. So they gathered in early July for 2 days at a Wesleyan chapel at Seneca Falls. Now, men were allowed to attend, but only on the second day. So when they gathered there, they have a couple of goals: to bring people together to start a full-blown movement. But then they made a list of grievances, if you will, a list of things that were denied to women. They came up with 11 resolutions, one per issue. Resolutions 1 through 10 were things like this. In some places, women could not legally divorce, whereas men had no fault divorce. They could just say, I divorce you. Women also, in certain circumstances, could not inherit property. What oftentimes happened is, let's say their husband died, they would hold the property for their oldest son until he became 16, and then it would go to him. Today, it's interesting that if there's a divorce with children involved, almost by default, the mother gets custody. But back then, almost by default, the father got custody. And in fact, there were cases when, if the husband died, the children would, young children, would be given to the wife's brother or the father's, the late husband's brother, and things of that effect. So they were looking at issues like divorce, custody, inheriting land and property. Women could not get a business license to open up a business, could not practice the law, could not practice medicine, just all sorts of things that they were looking at. So those were resolutions 1 through 10, and all those passed unanimously. However, resolution 11 was the difficult one. This is the right to vote. So Stanton was worried that the right to vote might upset a lot of men, could upset a lot of preachers. It could upset the few Southerners that were involved in the effort. So she and Frederick Douglass discussed it, and there was some consideration to maybe we don't push the right to vote. In the end analysis, they both went back in, and it said that they gave inspiring speeches. And Frederick Douglass was like a Martin Luther King. He was a brilliant orator, so one can only imagine what he had to say. And the 11th resolution passed. And they put together a declaration modeled on the direct Declaration of Independence, and they added a really nice tweak. A lot of men at the time said women were too sentimental to be in politics and deserve the right to vote. So they named it the Declaration of Sentiments. And it passed. So the movement gets up and running. Now, Cheryl, can you see, it should say Civil War? Yes, okay, good. So, so the movement gets up and running after Seneca Falls. However, everything is put on hold during the Civil War, of course, 1861 to 65. We know that Lincoln pushed to put black men in uniform with this idea, and Frederick Douglass sent his own sons to fight with this idea that we don't want to be given freedom, we want to help earn it. Well, the mothers of the women's movement realized that the Civil War was an opportunity for them to prove their mettle. And you know, some women, so I just finished this past year a book on the Civil War, and I was amazed at how many women in disguise fought in the Civil War. Some served as spies, with men not suspecting that women would do such a thing. Women were captured, imprisoned, women died during the Civil War. But many of the mothers of the movement from Seneca Falls decided to serve as nurses during the Civil War. Now, I want you to imagine this. Imagine a field hospital circa 1862. You would have battles with 30,000 men against 20,000 men, with thousands dead and thousands of casualties. Think of the primitive state of medicine. You would have a table under a tent, and that would be your field hospital. You'd have one surgeon, and he would have a handsaw, and that's about all he was dealing with. So the women, the mothers of the movement, it's not like they went to Case Western Reserve College of Nursing. They were self-taught. They would have to, a soldier would come in with a gunshot through the arm, through the leg. Now remember, with the primitive state of medicine and thousands of men suffering casualties, the physician did not have the time or the ability to repair a broken bone and a torn artery. There were only two options. One, cauterize it, and they always kept a fire next to the surgeon's table with a hot piece of metal in it, and they would just stick that metal into the open wound to try to cauterize it, or amputation. There were descriptions during all Civil War battles next to the surgeon's tent and table of a several foot high pile of legs, arms, hands, feet, because of the amputations. So imagine the women that were serving as nurses. A man would come in with a gunshot wound or a cannonball taking off part of his leg and ready to lose consciousness, in shock. They had to get him, put him up on the operating table, give him a shot of whiskey. They carried a piece of rawhide, like you would give a dog, for him to bite down on. And then they held him to the table while the surgeon took the saw out. They'd have to drag the man off the table, try to comfort him, throw a bucket of water on the table to wash the blood and guts off, and bring the next man up. They earned their stripes during the war, serving nobly. When the war was over, they had two other great contributions. One was founding orphanages and foster care. Today, in most parts of the United States, this is especially true in Florida, I regret to say, our foster care and adoption systems are horrific. Can you imagine in the 1800s? We have hundreds of thousands of men dead and hundreds of thousands, if not a few million, injured. There were a lot of children in need and a lot of orphan children. It was a lot of the mothers of the women's movement who then organized these things, which was remarkable. They were also great supporters of Abraham Lincoln. I've often wondered that if Lincoln had lived, if the 15th Amendment, 1870, that gave Black men the right to vote, if women might not have been a part of it, because Lincoln was supportive of their efforts and they were among his biggest supporters. So when Lincoln envisions Reconstruction after the Civil War, which was a radical idea of forgiving the South, not forgetting, but forgiving. Remember, Lincoln says to Grant and Chamberlain and others at Appomattox Courthouse when Lee surrenders, Lincoln tells them, I don't want to see Lee in chains. I don't want to see him dragged through the, I don't want to see him or other officers disrespected. And then Grant and Chamberlain, on Lincoln's orders, they told Lee and others to just go home. Take your horse, take your sidearm, go home. In fact, the Northern Band at Appomattox, when they surrendered, they played Dixie to show respect. A remarkably magnanimous president, Lincoln was. So this idea of forgiveness and Reconstruction, we will rebuild the South, was not popular among a lot of Northerners who had just lost a generation of men and the economy was tanked because of the Civil War. But it was popular among the leaders of the women's movement. And they supported Lincoln's three great Reconstruction amendments. The 13th Amendment in 1865, which ended slavery, which was the only one, tragically, that Lincoln lived to see. He was the architect of the rest, but didn't live to see them. The 14th Amendment in 1868, which is equal protection and citizenship, and the 15th Amendment in 1870, which gives Black men the right to vote. One of the other things the mothers of the movement did after the war was temperance. Now, temperance, I think, is depicted incorrectly in most textbooks. It's depicted as fuddy-duddy church-going ladies with a big hat who don't like alcohol and harass men that drink. That's inaccurate. What the mothers of the movement, the reason why they supported temperance was because of child abuse, spousal abuse, domestic violence, and rape. You can imagine, I mean, the statistics today on domestic violence and rape are just unconscionable. Imagine in the 1800s. You know, I've done a lot of research and I've written several books in my career that are set in the 17 and 1800s. So I've kind of a rule that I've come up with, having spent years in reading thousands of newspaper articles and dozens of diaries and hundreds of military reports. I believe that it's safe to say that 1 out of 3 men were full-blown alcoholics. I'm talking face down in the alley, drunk in the 17 and 1800s. It was an epidemic. It was a pandemic. So you can imagine all the violence associated with it. So these mothers of the movement, they saw temperance as a way of reducing rape, domestic violence, and child abuse. And we didn't even have terms for that back then. So that's what they were engaged in. Now, there would be new leadership. Can you see the new screen, Cheryl, where it says new leadership? Good? Okay, good. All right, I think we're working. So new leadership in the post-war years. But there was a big problem. The women's movement, the right to vote, it's split. You had 2 wings. You had the National Women's Suffrage Association, which was led by Susan B. Anthony, who's on the right there. And you had the American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Lucy Stone, who's on the left. The split was over a couple of things. One was ideology. The National Women's Suffrage, Susan B. Anthony, was much more conservative, much more cautious. The American Women's Suffrage, Lucy Stone, was much more, you could say, liberal, aggressive, progressive. Also over the issue of family planning. Susan B. Anthony was against abortion and against a lot of family planning. Lucy Stone was in favor of it. So this was a big split. Some of the more, I guess you could use progressive, Lucy Stone supporters wondered about this idea of family planning, if it wasn't too controversial for most men and, American society circa the late 1800s and preachers and so on. But then they decided, no, the only way women are going to be able to work and contribute to society is they have to have control over how many times they're pregnant. In the 1800s, it was not uncommon for a woman to have 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, 12, 15 children, and infant mortality rates were just off the charts. So who had time to contribute? So that was the big rift. It was over other things too, but I don't have the time to get into all that. There was a healing between the rift that emerges in 1890. And you're looking at a very interesting woman here. This is Carrie Chapman Catt, C-A-T-T. Carrie Chapman Catt brings the National and the American Women's Suffrage Association movements together and forms the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She reminds everybody, look, we need to be united. We need to focus, keep our eye on the prize here instead of arguing with one another. So Carrie Chapman Catt does that. She does a lot else. Let me just, for the sake of time, discuss 2 of them. One, she thinks that maybe for some older women and men, it's too late. You're not going to change men's minds, and women may not get the right to vote in time. What we need to do is look at the younger generation. And what she does is she trains young women to go out and give interviews to newspapers, to give speeches. And it's a paradigm shift, everyone. Most men don't think women are capable of doing this. All of a sudden, young women are getting up with great articulation and passion and being very well informed and discussing these political issues. So she's using that to try to change the paradigm. Here's the other thing she does. I think this is really clever. In order to change the Constitution, which they'd have to do to get an amendment to give women the right to vote, in order to change the Constitution, you need 2/3 of the House and Senate, but then you need what? 3/4 of the states. So she says, look, it's very difficult to get 3/4 of the states. So why don't we do this? Why don't we go one state at a time? We're going to need all the states eventually, right? Or at least 3/4 of them. So if we can get one state to recognize women's right to vote, that's a win. Then we have a model or a template that we can replicate elsewhere. So let's go state by state by state instead of nationwide, which is so simple, but it's brilliant. So the women suffragists support her. By the way, most folks prefer suffragist instead of suffragette, E-T-T-E. So that's why I use the term. So here's what she says. Let's go state by state. That makes sense. You would think, where would be the logical place to start? New York, Massachusetts, more progressive northeastern states. She says, no, we're going to start with the Wyoming Territory. We're going to start in Colorado, Idaho. Are you ready for this? Utah, And back in the late 1800s, this was the wild, wild west. These places were straight out of a Clint Eastwood cowboy movie, right? And she said, we're going to start out there. This is crazy. Why would you do this? But she was a step ahead of everyone. Here's why. Those places didn't have any women, which meant the men were desperate. So she goes to Wyoming, she goes to Idaho, Colorado, and says, would you support a woman's right to vote? If so, here's what I'll do. I will bring women out to your state. And the men said, yeah, let's make it happen quick. So the quid pro quo was if these places allowed women the right to vote, she would bring women out there. You know, before this, in the spring and fall, usually not in the winter and summer because of the weather, but in the spring and fall, an enterprising entrepreneur would bring a wagon full of prostitutes from out east all the way out west, and that would be about the only women in the area. So Carrie Chapman Catt gets all these places to come on board with the promise of bringing women out. Then here's what she does. Once they agree to give women the right to vote, she says, before I do this, I need something else. We need the right to divorce, own property, inherit, own land, get a business license, custody, all the things I talked about earlier. And they all said, yeah, now hurry up and bring the women out. So what she did then is she goes back east and she tells a lot of women who were entrepreneurial minded. She says, look, you're having trouble getting a business license. These cities won't let you open up a non-traditional business for women. If you go out west, they have business licenses waiting for you. There's no competition. You can open up a hotel, a restaurant, pick it. And a lot of women went out and she made good on her promise. So remarkably thoughtful what she did. Next, so fast forward, the women's movement was excited in the year 1912 because Woodrow Wilson was running for president. Wilson had been a professor and president at Princeton, and he was a self-proclaimed progressive who said he wanted to finish the progressive agenda of the great Teddy Roosevelt, who had been president from 1901 to 1909. Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, but a progressive Republican at a time when both political parties kind of merged and then switched positions. So Teddy Roosevelt, remember, he's the father of conservation, national parks. He pushes child labor laws, a prototype of a minimum wage, a standardized work week. We have him and unions to thank for this radical idea of the weekend. So Teddy Roosevelt pushes a lot of things. He also favored a woman's right to vote and universal health care, but he wasn't able to do that. So the women's movement is inspired that Wilson will do this. So they get behind and support Wilson in 1912, even though they can't vote. And guess what? Wilson wins. So in 1913, at the inauguration, and back then the inauguration was on March 4th. Today it's January 20th. In the year 1937, for FDR's second inaugural, they moved it up. So there were great, and you can see the picture here. There were great parades in 1913 on the day before the inaugural, as women leaders knew that Wilson would embrace this, and it was only a matter of time. And you can see the pictures here. There were some that were really over the top. Some of the women dressed up like Amazons and Vikings and with swords and big helmets and rode on horses down the streets of Washington. However, Wilson does what? He flip-flops. He comes into office and now doesn't support a woman's right to vote. What a letdown. But two things would happen. Number one, Wilson's wife, Ellen Axon Wilson, dies in office as the sitting first lady. And Wilson is racked with remorse, grief, and guilt. It turns out he was having a number of affairs when his wife passed. One was with a woman named Mrs. Peck, P-E-C-K, who was wealthy and had a home in Bermuda and the Bahamas. And Wilson used to go to her home with her, and people in Congress who were in the know used to call Wilson Mrs. Peck's bad boy. So Wilson was racked with guilt. So he wants to do something to honor his late wife and to promote women's issues. So he starts thinking, he also has 3 daughters. He starts thinking that maybe I should support a woman's right to vote after all. And then the second thing that happens is he meets a saucy widow named Edith Bowling Galt. And here she is with Wilson. So Edith Bowling Galt, her husband had been a jeweler and leaves her with a lot of money. And she was really, really scandalous in Washington. Heck, today she'd be a Kardashian. Would you all like to know how scandalous she was? Cheryl, is it okay if I tell them? I don't know. I mean, this is the Siegel Lifelong Learning and it's Case Western, right? I don't know if I'm pushing. Okay, so do it. All right. So you ready for this, everyone?
I say go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay, here we go. Here's how scandalous Edith Bowling Galt was. She drove her own car. That was a huge scandal back then. Newspapers and prominent people used to gossip about how horrible she was. She drove her own car. Here's the second scandal. She used to go to parties unescorted. I mean, that was like being a stripper today or something, I guess. So it was quite a scandal. So Woodrow Wilson meets Edith, and she rocks his world. The press follow them around when they're courting everywhere they go. The press stake out the White House, and they see Edith coming out early in the morning, which was a big scandal. The joke was that when World War I started, it was so shocking that Edith fell out of the president's bed. That was the joke. Also, one of the greatest typos in history happened here, that the press wanted to write that the president was again seen entertaining Miss Galt in public. But there was a typo, and it said the president was again seen entering Miss Galt in public. So one heck of a typo. So this was a really scandalous affair they were having. And then Wilson marries Edith while he's the sitting president. And some people felt it was a little too quick, sort of as quick, I guess, as the Cleveland Brisket Brigade. Am I right about that one, Cheryl? Okay, so that's moving pretty quick. So Edith comes in and she pushes Wilson to promote a woman's right to vote. So in 1918, they introduced to Congress a measure for women to have the right to vote, and the Wilsons are supportive of it. It passes the House, but it's 2 votes shy in the Senate. Remember, you need a 2/3 supermajority. Usually when something like this fails, it's years before it's reintroduced, but they wanted to reintroduce it quickly while Wilson was still president, and importantly, while Edith was still first lady. So they reintroduced it in 1920. Now, here's the story of it being considered 1920 and the passage of the 19th Amendment. I always call the story a man, a mother, and a good boy. Is that what you're looking at, Cheryl? You can see that screen? Good. A man, a mother, and a good boy. So here's your story of how the 19th Amendment passes in 1920. You're looking at the man right here. His name was Congressman James Mann with 2 N's. And here's some brilliant politicking. A lot of the supporters of the women's movement lean on him to introduce the amendment. Why? He's a Republican. So they wanted to show that this should be bipartisan. It shouldn't just be a Democratic issue. Teddy Roosevelt supported it. It should be a bipartisan issue. So a Republican from Illinois introduces the measure. Now, it passes the House, and you can see the numbers. I put them here on your screen. It passes the Senate. This thing's rushing through. Now it goes to the states. And those Western states that were quick to initially do it, they all come on board and ratify it. The Northeast comes on board and ratifies it. But the South overwhelmingly, unanimously votes against it. So they're 1 state shy by March of 1920, 1 state shy. They need 1 more state to get to the 3/4 limit. The bad news for the women's movement is that state is Tennessee, the only Southern state that didn't vote. So it doesn't look good for passing it because Tennessee is a conservative state. There's no way Tennessee is going to vote to give women the right to vote. So everybody descends on Tennessee. The women's suffrage movement descends on Tennessee. And then here you can see from the sign on the screen, there were not only women's suffrage groups, there were organizations opposed to women's suffrage that formed. Preachers, some Republicans, conservatives, all descend on Tennessee to oppose this. So Tennessee is now ground zero. It's time to have a vote in Tennessee. and they have the vote. And guess what, everyone? It's a tie, 48-48. Now, remember I said the story is a man, a mother, and a good boy. So here's the mother and the good boy. It's a 48-48 tie, but they found out there was one member of the Tennessee legislature who didn't vote. He was sick. He was at home with his mother. He wasn't feeling well. And you're looking at him. His name was Harry T. Byrne. He's the youngest member of the legislature. He's only 23. He looks about 16, doesn't he? So he's only 23. So it all comes down to Harry. Now, the bad news for the women's movement is Harry is conservative, representing a conservative district, so he'll probably vote against women getting the right to vote. But Harry's at home, and his mother is nursing him back to health. She hears about this, and she tells him, you go and vote. Now, the kicker was, we talked about Carrie Chapman Catt. Some of the opponents to getting to a woman's right to vote, they were name-calling and bullying, if you could imagine such a thing. They were calling Carrie Chapman Catt Carrie Chapman Rat. And they were saying that they smelled a rat in ratification. So that's what they were saying. So Harry's with his mother. Her name is Febb Byrne, F-E-B-B, Febb Byrne. I'm sure she gives Harry some chicken noodle soup or maybe some matzo ball soup, right? And she sends him back the vote, but she writes a letter for him. And she says, before you cast the deciding vote, I want you to read this letter. And here's what she said in the letter. I put it on your screen. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification. And Harry voted for it. And from 1840 until 1920, after 80 years, women got the right to vote by one single vote. And there he is. Okay, I wanted to quickly talk about two other things. I want to talk about challenges that have faced women, and I want to end by talking about women that have run for the presidency, okay? And then I'll take questions. So several years ago, I did two projects. I surveyed women in elected office around the country, of both parties, all different types of office. And then I followed it up with interviews with several of them. And the first question I asked them was this: as a woman, what would you say is the biggest challenge you face in politics? And what they told me was perhaps the biggest challenge women face is, number one, you're looking at it on the screen, fundraising. The average woman against the average man running for office, men out fundraise women. Now, I don't mean the $20 that me or the $30 that Cheryl sends, or, Brian probably sends 1,000 to candidates. I mean the big bucks. The average man gets a lot more money than the average woman. In modern times, there's really only been 3 women that have been able to fundraise with the biggest male fundraisers, and that's Hillary Clinton, Sarah Palin, and Nancy Pelosi. Other than that, women have a lot of trouble fundraising. So I interviewed one woman who was a state senator from Alabama, a Republican. And if I remember, she was the only woman in the state Senate at the time. I asked her, I said, what's your biggest challenge, as a woman? And she said, oh, that's easy. I don't golf. So I said, all right, what are you talking about? And she said, well, where do you think they raise money? She said, we raise it in 3 places: at the private club, and nobody invites me there; at the Alabama-Auburn football games, and nobody invites me there; and the golf course. So I said, Senator, with all due respect, you better learn how to golf. She says, are you kidding me? She goes, I'm a state senator. I have a full-time job. I have children. I'm married. Who has the time to golf? So she was talking about how difficult it is in terms of the formats for fundraising. Another thing that women told me when I asked them to name a challenge, they named what we call the second shift syndrome. Second shift syndrome. Here's what it is. Even today, among 2-income couples, both the wife and husband work, who do you think still does 90% of the domestic work? Women. Cooking, cleaning, sewing, laundry, diaper changing, shopping, you name it. Women are still doing the lion's share of it. The average man in the United States has 2, 3, 4 times as much leisure time as the average woman. Here's what this means. If you want to run for office, you need a lot of free time to go out for drinks, go to the club, campaign, meet with fundraisers. And the average woman just doesn't have the time if they're so busy with the domestic work, with domesticity. So we've got to find a way of getting men to pull their weight and do more of the domestic work, freeing women up to run for office. Otherwise, women are simply not going to be running for office. And if they're not running for office, they're not getting elected. If you don't take the shot, you don't score the basket, right? Another thing women told me was the empty nest syndrome. The empty nest syndrome. What this is a question. When do men run for office? Answer, whenever they want to. Question, when do women run for office? When the kids are grown and out of the house, right? So if we're waiting until later to get married, if then we're waiting later to have kids, and if a lot of kids are moving home because of a bad economy, women could be perceived as being too old to run for office when they finally start to run. So we've got to find a way of encouraging women to run earlier so that we can elect men and women in equal numbers. I'm going to skip a lot of the things I have there and just talk about the last one on the screen, which is ambition. Now, I don't think ambition's the right word, so hear me out. Maybe the right word is prudent, rational, wise, realistic. I'm not sure what the right word is, but there are a number of studies, and I asked women in elected office this as well, that have some really interesting results. Here it is. They asked men and women, if you only had a 1 to 5% chance of winning, would you still run for office? The far majority of men say what? Of course. What do the majority of women say? No. Similarly, if you have to raise an obscene amount of money and take donations from really unsavory sources, would you still run for office? What do most men say? Sure, of course. What do most women say? No. So if women have scruples, concerns, or if they're more realistic, they're simply not going to be running. We have to get women to run. Remember, if you want to win an election, you need to be a single-minded seeker of elections. You need to be a shark on the blood trail. If you have all these qualms and concerns, you're not going to get elected. Perhaps my favorite question is this. They asked men and women, if you knew you were going to be the target of negative attack ads, would you still run for office? The far majority of men say yes. The majority of women say no. As an interesting follow-up to that, they ask, if you knew you were going to be hit by negative attack ads, would you go negative on your opponent? Women are more likely than men to say no. So we need women to start running unleashed, unhinged, no concerns. Otherwise, they're not going to get elected in the same numbers, okay? So women have been running for the presidency for a long time, and that's probably our last glass ceiling that really needs to be shattered. And once that's shattered, the floodgates are going to come and women will get elected in bigger numbers to all offices. Does anybody know when the first woman ran for office and who it was? I know Claire knows, so Claire, don't say anything. Does anybody know when did the first woman run for office and who was it? Here's your answer, everybody. Aren't you glad you signed up for this lecture? Victoria Woodhull, 1872. There she is. She was an amazing woman, young, attractive, smart, self-taught lawyer. She published a book, just a remarkable woman, a Renaissance woman, ran in 1872. Of course, neither political party would allow her to run in their party, so she had to run under a third party, the Equal Rights Party. And when she would try to register to vote and then try to vote, she was arrested. So she wasn't even out of jail to even campaign. Her vice presidential running mate was none other than Frederick Douglass. Isn't that cool? What a ticket, right, Claire? I used to write a Sunday column for one of our newspapers here in Florida. And in 2008, when Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were running, and there was some talk that they might be a ticket, I remember writing in my column saying, Victoria Woodhull and Frederick Douglass are in heaven looking down at us saying, What on earth took you so long? The next woman that ran was this person. That's Belva Lockwood. She ran twice in the 1880s. She didn't make a serious run. She was just trying to shake things up when she ran. Then we'd have a long time before another woman ran. It would be until 1964 when Margaret Chase Smith. By the way, Cheryl, is the image up of Margaret Chase Smith? Good. So Margaret Chase Smith ran in 1964. She would have another historic first. This is the first woman to run on a major party ticket. She ran as a Republican. Does anybody out there remember Margaret Chase Smith? You're all too young. You were born in what, the 60s and 70s? So Cheryl, your audience is way too young to remember Margaret Chase Smith. She had been both a representative and a senator from Maine, remarkable person. I never got the chance to meet her, but she had written and said that here's her big frustration. The press and her colleagues always referred to her male colleagues who were running as senator, governor, whatever, but they always called her Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Smith. Then we'd have another historic first in 1972, the first African-American to run, and therefore the first African-American woman to run. This is Shirley Chisholm. Anybody remember Shirley Chisholm? Now we go. Yeah, there we go. 1972. Claire, when you were about 4, I think, you and I, when we were kids. So Shirley Chisholm from New York ran unbought and unbossed was always her motto. By the way, her campaign colors and look of her logo and all that, Kamala Harris used the same. So she was channeling Shirley Chisholm. Take a look at the logo and a lot of her campaign materials. I did have a chance to meet Shirley Chisholm. Why? Because she was from New York. And as you all know, if you're from New York or Cleveland, you eventually have to go to South Florida, right? That's a law in your city and a law in New York. So Shirley Chisholm came to Florida, and I asked her what her big frustration was in terms of running. And here's what she told me. She said that Black men would not support her. They said that the first African-American that runs should be a man, not a woman. And she said, these are the same guys that I marched beside in the 60s. So she said this. She said that she felt that her sex was a bigger obstacle politically than her race. And she said, we will elect a Black man before we elect a white woman. And you know what I said? Nah. She was right, huh? Amazing. Then we'd have another historic first. In 1984, Geraldine Ferraro. Y'all remember Jerry Ferraro? Yeah, 1984. She was a 3-time congresswoman and a former tough attorney. She was Walter Mondale's vice president on that Democratic ticket. So the first woman to be a vice presidential nominee on a major party ticket. Now, Ferraro was from New York. So you know, if you're from New York or Cleveland, what's the rule? You have to move to South Florida. So she did, and I interviewed her twice, and I asked her the same question. What was her frustration? And this is what she told me. She said, you know, you have men's issues and you have women's issues. Men talk about things like crime and the economy and national security, war. Women talk about children's issues, education, healthcare, the environment. And she said, I wanted to make sure that my first major speech as the first woman VP on a major party ticket was going to shatter that glass ceiling. So she said, I decided to give it about national security. So I asked her, how did it go? And she said, my speech went well, but then it collapsed afterward. Why? The very first question she received after giving a 30-minute speech on national security was, what designer are you going to be wearing? So I asked her, what'd you say? She said, I couldn't say anything, because if I talked about Calvin Klein or Ralph Lauren or whatever, she said, I wouldn't look like a tough commander-in-chief, would I? But if I told the reporter, you know, the heck with you for asking that, she said, I'd be the word that rhymes with rich. So she was in a pickle. So this is the kind of thing that she faced. The other big frustration she told me was the way her Republican opponents, and the media treated her husband, John Zuccaro. You know, oftentimes when a man's running, fortunately, the opposition party and press leave the first lady or the wife alone. Hillary got hit pretty hard and ugly, and Michelle Obama got a lot of ugly attacks. But fortunately, I think they've largely left other first ladies and spouses alone, and kids. But if a woman runs, her husband's fair game. So they went after Zuccaro, her husband, viciously, and that was a big frustration of hers. 4 years later, we'd have another woman that ran. This is Pat Schroeder. Y'all remember her? Claire, you met her in January, right? So Pat Schroeder was from Colorado, first woman to serve on the Armed Services Committee, breaking another barrier. And she told me that when she served on Armed Services, there was her and an African-American man, and it was the first, historic first for both. The chair of the Armed Services Committee was from Louisiana and was an old school racist. And what he did was he didn't have enough chairs set out for the committee. They were one chair shy. And he announced to the committee, if you can imagine in the 70s, he said to the African-American and female members of the committee, "You're both worth half a person in my eyes, so you can share a seat." I asked Schroeder, "What'd you do?" She said, "I walked out." And the committee chair started laughing, saying, "You see, a woman's not tough enough." She said, "No, I walked outside, went to the next room, got a chair, dragged it in, and set it next to his." You go, girl. So I asked Schroeder about frustrations, and this is what she told me. She said, sometimes a woman's biggest critic is another woman. She said, "I was shocked at how much blowback I got from other women." She said, and she gave me several examples. Here's two. She said, "I was campaigning once and a woman handed me a check, and it was a small check, let's say $15 or something. And she said the woman wanted to whisper something in my ear. So when I leaned forward, the woman said, 'Now go do something with your hair.'" Wow. She said the same thing happened not long afterward, and a woman said to her, "Do you know that your purse and your shoes do not match?" Now, I've had the great pleasure of getting to know Pat Schroeder over the years, and we've done many programs together. The first time I interviewed her was probably 30 years ago when I asked this. So at the time, I had no idea that a woman's shoes and purse had to match. It was news to me. But think about it. No one makes fun of or criticizes what men wear, but they're always after a woman for what they wear. I was an analyst for our NBC station and our PBS station down here in South Florida for many, many years. And I became good friends with the morning and the evening female anchors who were around my age, that is to say, a very youthful late 50s. And at the time, they were, late 40s, early 50s, mid 50s, because I quit my media work 2-3 years ago. At any rate, the female anchors always talked about, they said, "Guess what the most common mail I get from the people that watch the TV station? It's, 'You gained weight. You ought to lose weight.'" Nobody would say that to men. My weight is like a roller coaster. I'm up 10, down 5, up 12, down 15. My weight's all over the place. But I've never in my life, giving a speech or doing media, had someone come up to me and say, "You gained weight." The other thing, she said that these anchors, the morning and evening anchors for both these stations, told me that the second most common thing they got was, "You wore that dress a month ago." Now, I have basically 3 white shirts, 3 pair of khaki pants, and 3 dark blazers. It's my uniform. I'm wearing one of the outfits now. And so if you watched me for 15 years on my Sunday morning show, basically I wore the same thing every Sunday. No one ever said anything about it. The third most common thing that those female anchors heard was people didn't like their hair. So people are not writing in about the news or interest rates or war or the latest thing the president said. They're writing in because they think the female anchors gain weight, need to get a haircut, and they wore the same dress a month or 2 ago. I have messy hair, and all the years that I did media, nobody ever complained about my hair. I never got fired because of my hair. I think Donald Trump and Joe Biden have the weirdest hairdos in the animal kingdom. but it didn't slow them down from running for office, but it affects women. Almost done, everyone. Elizabeth Dole ran in the year 2000. Technically, she ran in 1999 for 2000 and dropped out. And she said this, that her big frustration was her shoes, that if she would wear comfortable shoes to campaign and walk around, think about campaigning in the winter in New Hampshire for that primary. If you did that, the media and everybody complained because she didn't have high heels on. If she put high heels on, they said, how are you going to campaign in those shoes? Nobody ever asks men. They never asked John Kerry about his Bruno Mallees. They never asked George W. Bush about his endangered species cowboy boots or whatever he was wearing. Nobody asked Trump or Biden about their shoes. Nobody's ever asked me about my shoes from Kmart. But they ask women about their shoes. Carol Moseley Braun, senator from Illinois, ran in 2004. Hillary, as you know, ran in 2008, and in 2016, an historic first, the first woman to win a major party nomination for president. Sarah Palin, I don't know how this picture got in there. Cheryl and Brian, I apologize. Somebody must have hacked my account and put that picture in there. You know me, I would never do such a thing. Sarah Palin made history, became the first female VP nominee on a Republican ticket. And I think excitingly, whether you like them or not, there were 6 women that ran this time around. 6. That's a record. That's remarkable. To close, I just want to say that women have been elected all around the world. Here's a partial list of women world leaders, yet not yet in the United States. Why is it that women all around the world can be elected, but not in the United States? Just 2 theories for the sake of time, because I want to bring this in an hour. One, many women around the world that have been elected have been prime ministers, not presidents. There's a difference. A parliamentary system and a presidential system, it's apples and oranges. To win in a presidential system like the United States, you need to raise upward of $500 million, and you need to run a 2-year-long nationwide expensive campaign. And if women can't raise money, in a parliamentary system, think about it, like in Israel or in England, all you need is a safe seat. And if you have a safe seat and rise up in seniority, if your party wins either a majority, it doesn't even need a majority. If you win just a plurality and have a coalition government like in Israel, you're the prime minister. The second theory on why women haven't won in the United States yet is many women around the world that have headed governments, they've been the wives or daughters or sisters of the previous leader. So there's these direct family ties. Here's a list. I haven't updated it for 2020. I apologize. Here's a list where it's shaded in of women world leaders in the year 2019. So women have been all around the world. Here's 85 countries have had women that have headed their governments. And you can see it's all over the world, yet noticeably absent the United States. Let me end with this thought. It's not a matter of if, but when. Women are breaking the glass ceiling, they're blazing past. Today, we have a record number of women in the House of Representatives. 102, everybody, a record. That's about a quarter. We have 25 women in the United States Senate. That's a quarter. That's a record also. 9 female governors, a handful of female lieutenant governors. All around the country, we've seen progress. We have 1 state that has a majority of its state legislature, House and Senate, are females. That's Nevada, 52%. Does it matter if women are elected? Nevada would suggest yes. In the last 2 years, you should see what the women in Nevada are doing. They've expanded healthcare, they've expanded childcare, they've expanded programs to protect schools, they've expanded environmental programs. It's remarkable what's happening. Colorado, look, Washington, Oregon, out west, well over 40%. The Northeast does a good job. Unfortunately, the gains that women have made are not everywhere. We see the South, Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, South Carolina. The South is still, Kentucky is still dragging way behind the rest of the country. Moreover, the gains are not equal. We've seen the Democratic Party doing a pretty good job nominating and electing women, but there's not enough Republican women. So if I think of, let's say, my students on campus, you know, when I was in school, I'm 58. So when I was in college, the only problem, I went to Virginia Tech, the only problem was when I took my history and politics classes, there were never any women in my classes. You know, I think the first female professor I had that was teaching history or politics was during my PhD program, my political economy class. There was one woman teaching it. And in my last semester, I took a Congress class and it was a woman. Today, we're a small percentage, so there's 3 of us that teach politics and history, me and 2 women. My vice president, my provost, is a woman. 50% of our politics and history majors on campus are women. Most of our student government, female. Women make up the far majority of students in veterinary schools of medicine. Women make about half of law schools. They're approaching half in medical schools, approaching half in graduate schools. Women are making great progress everywhere. If I think of my dad and my grandpa, my uncles, none of them ever had a female boss, a female attorney, a female dentist, a female, hell, they wouldn't even have had a female veterinarian. They would have taken the dog to a male vet. But if I think about my own kids or my students on campus, everyone has had a female lawyer, accountant, professor, boss, without even thinking about it. So there's a great change that's happening, and it's not if, but when, and whether or not you support Harris, it's irrelevant. What's exciting for the purpose of this lecture is we have a front row seat to history. We have a female vice presidential nominee and could have the first sitting female vice president. And Biden has also said that half of his cabinet will be female, which, whether you like him or not, is exciting. We saw Barack Obama appointing record numbers of women. We saw Bill Clinton appointing a lot of women. George W. Bush did okay. Now Trump's taken a giant step backward, but this is exciting to think about the consequence of that. And with that, I thank you for your time, and we bring it in an hour. Questions?
Robert, so one of the questions I'm seeing here is, let's see, why was Sandra Day O'Connor not picked to run for political office, but instead was chosen to break the glass ceiling at the Supreme Court?
Okay, good question. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Sandra Day O'Connor and interview. Claire, didn't you go to that interview? No, you weren't at that one? Okay, I thought you were. Okay. I interviewed her for a C-SPAN program, and I interviewed her for a civility program. She runs, it's called iCivics. And Sandra Day O'Connor, I will say, probably about 25 years ago, she said, this country is going to pay a terrible toll because we no longer teach civics. We're going to elect the wrong people. We're going to lose a sense of civility. People won't know about their government. So she has this wonderful program. I run a civility program on campus, and I have done civics workshops for 30 years for school teachers for free. So this is where we connected. Sandra Day O'Connor wanted and wants nothing to do with politics. She never did. She loved the law. That was her great passion. So even if the Republican Party had asked her to run for office, she would have said no. But, you know, she did blaze trails as the first woman ever to serve on the Supreme Court. And she told me that she had, you know, not dozens, not hundreds, but countless women contacted her and said, you know, I'm motivated to be a lawyer because of you. So she did her good deed. Yeah.
I have another question here, asking you to address the issue of white suffragettes and the discrimination of Black suffragists.
Yeah. Yeah, good. That's a great question, whomever asked that. Yeah, you're spot on. I regret to say, as much as I like Carrie Chapman Catt, as much as I like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and some of these, now Stanton, not so much, but a lot of the other ones, the women's suffrage movement was tainted by racism. There were Black women that were marching, were advocating, agitating, they were activists, But a lot of the white leaders of the women's suffrage movement did not bring Black women into the inner circle. And quite frankly, if you read some of their letters, they're tainted by racism. And that is something that really is frustrating to me. How some of these folks could be so progressive minded, so dedicated to women's rights, and yet be racist. You know, I guess Cheryl and Brian, you probably, you know, we've known one another for a few years and you've listened to me blah, blah, blah far too much. I know Claire has heard this because Claire and I are good friends, but something I've said my entire adult life is, for the life of me, I don't understand how a woman could be racist. And I don't understand how someone who's Black can be homophobic. And I don't understand how someone who's gay can be an anti-Semite. I don't understand how people can have experienced, you know, bigotry in all of its horrific shapes and forms, and then turn around and do the same thing. But yeah, you're right. The women's suffrage movement would have been a lot better off had it opened its arms. And the irony, the great irony here, it's perplexing to me, is Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, the mothers who started it all, they started their activism to try to end slavery and for equality. That's where it started, and yet the movement got lost along the way. Good.
I think that's all the questions we had.
Anyone
So-
else?
If you want to unmute if somebody wants to unmute themselves, they can ask a question.
Yes, I had a question. You didn't address the abuse that the suffragists endured in, you know, being force-fed, had things thrown at them. I mean, it was really tough for them.
Yes, it was. Is it Tony? Thank you for the question. Yeah, there's a lot I missed. You know, I was looking at my screen and my watch and realized I was running far late. So I cut an awful lot out. Alice Paul, for example, who was one of the leaders in the early 1900s, she was arrested repeatedly, put in jail. She went on a hunger strike at one point and was force-fed. Several of these women were attacked and beaten. They had people spit on them. So yeah, so this is an ugly part of our history. And a lot of them really paid a price. I once went to an academic conference, and Brian can tell you that if you can stay awake at an academic conference, you're doing something. But I did stay awake through one panel, and it was a couple of experts on women's suffrage. This was several years ago, and I was trying to bone up a bit on the topic because I teach a course on, you know, that discusses women in history and Black history and other things. And they were saying that more than one marriage dissolved over this as well, that some of these folks lost their marriage and they were beaten and mistreated. Not long ago, I was reading about the 1964 Civil Rights Act and how Lyndon Johnson sent his wife, Lady Bird, into the South to campaign. I had the magnificent opportunity years ago of interviewing Lady Bird Johnson on the phone. She was pretty advanced in years. And something really good came out of it besides getting to talk to Lady Bird. I was trying to interview all the living first ladies, and I was getting nowhere. So once I got Lady Bird Johnson, I immediately, as soon as I hung up the phone, I called Betty Ford Ross Carter and said, Lady Bird Johnson just talked to me. And everyone but Nancy Reagan said, okay, we'll talk to you. So Lady Bird Johnson was sent through the South to try to minimize the losses LBJ would have in the South because he signed the '64 Civil Rights Act. And Lady Bird Johnson was spit on. She had her life threatened. She was booed. She was pushed. So not unlike the suffragists who encountered the same kind of thing. So yeah, good point, Tony. Thanks for bringing that up. Brian has an announcement here. Do you want to unmute Brian or?
Yeah, and as a way of wrapping up, but also addressing a couple of questions that did come up. We have a wide range of individuals that speak on all sorts of academic topics, coming from varied backgrounds, all genders, all races. And we actually have been running a year-long series of talks related to the centennial of women's suffrage. Robert, we're glad to have you be part of that. But I don't want anyone to think that, for example, Dr. Watson is the only person perhaps that we would have brought in over the course of the year to speak on this topic. But I do think you have, through your own work and certainly personal engagement with some of the figures involved, definitely more to say than we otherwise would hear. But my announcement is that our series continues on September 23rd with Professor Joy Bostic, who actually comes out of the religion department at Case Western Reserve University, who will be giving a talk titled The Long Arc of Justice in the Beloved Community, Courage and Resilience in Black Women's Struggle for Universal Voting Rights and Political Power. So that will be a Zoom lecture on September 23rd. Please be in touch with the Lifelong Learning Office if you have an interest in joining us for that. And thank you again, Robert, for sharing your time, your experiences and your expertise. And I thank all of you for spending your time with us. We think a good hour plus well spent in exercising our minds. So thank you all, and we wish you a great fall season.
Thank you, everyone, and congratulations, Brian, on a wonderful series, of course, with the exception of your current speaker. Thank you, everybody. I can't wait to get back to Cleveland. Be safe and take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you. Fascinating talk.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Bye, Claire.